Namaste friends. Welcome to another morning sharing satsang on Swami Shri Yukteswar Giri's The Holy Signs. As always, we'll begin with a chant. I am thee, Lord, I am thee. Thou art me, Lord, thou art me. Thou art me, Lord, thou art me. Wind and air, Lord, wave and sea. I am thee, Lord, I am thee. Thou art me, Lord, thou art me. Thou art me, Lord, thou art me. Wind and air, Lord, wave and sea. Thou art me, Lord, thou art me. Wind and air, Lord, wave and sea. I am thee, Lord, I am thee. Thou art me, Lord, thou art me. I am thee, Lord, I am thee. Thou art me, Lord, thou art me. Thou art me, Lord, thou art me. Wind and air, Lord, wave and sea. Thou art me, Lord, thou art me. Wind and air, Lord, wave and sea. Wind and air, Lord, wave and sea. Thou art me, Lord, thou art me. Let's take that melody and those words into a brief meditation, offering our prayers to Babaji, to Swami Shri Yukteswar Giri, to Paramhansa Yogananda, all the gurus of this lineage, drawing upon their grace in our lives. Om Shanti. Hello friends. I apologize because I've had a couple of weeks of break in this webinar series. We have had issues live streaming onto Facebook, so I did not live stream last week. This week I'm just doing it on live stream. And of course, as always, all the videos will eventually get posted on my YouTube channel. So if you're following it in sequence, you can follow it there. I'm going to try and keep my schedule up to date, and you can always check the calendar on anandapaloalto.org. I'll try and make sure it's accurate, and we have a webinar whenever it says that we are going to have a webinar. Thank you for bearing with that. In the last episode that I did, we actually finished chapter 1, not because we went through each and every sutra, but because most of them towards the second part of the first chapter, they were beyond my qualification to comment on. They are, of course, speaking of very high esoteric cosmic truths, but I'm not sure I can add any experience or wisdom to what Yukteswar Giri is stating, and I don't even know if I can fully comprehend it. And yet it was helpful for us to simply hear those verses, what he was saying, tune into it just in spirit to receive whatever it is that we are able to. Maybe there is some intuition that will come to us when we even just simply sit with these verses. I'm going to move on to chapter 2. If you remember my introduction when we started this series, I had mentioned that the different chapters of this book almost closely align with different systems of Indian philosophy. The first section closely aligned, the chapter that we just finished, is closely aligns with the Sankhya philosophy. Again, as Yukteswar Giri already says, it has a lot more parallels with the Bible, the revelations in the Bible. That's why we had many Bible verses also that we looked at in that section. Now, the second chapter of the book is going to go, as far as I see it, it is talking more about the Vedanta philosophy. That is also an important system in the Indian way of thinking. And there are only a couple of Bible verses. This is simply Yukteswar Giri stating the summary of the Vedanta philosophy. And it's actually very interesting. It's very simple, almost too simple, like the core of truth always is. It is worth meditating on every verse. I wouldn't say it's necessarily all that abstract in terms of what he's stating, teaching, but certainly it is not always part of our realization. These are just truths that we hear a lot in theory, but unless we are able to lift our consciousness or expand into that high state, we may or may not be able to live in them all the time. And yet it is always helpful to meditate on them, to tune into their essence. So without more explanation around that, I'm going to read the first sutra of the second chapter of the Holy Science. The second chapter is called The Goal, and in Sanskrit it is titled Abhishtam. Abhishtam, again, it's a goal is almost an exact translation of what it is. I am going to read the Sanskrit verses in these first few sutras that we will talk about today, because I feel like even the word-by-word meaning of these verses is quite helpful in tuning into the spirit. Somebody had asked me, had written to me asking if I can provide the word-by-word meaning of every Sanskrit verse for them to follow along. I'm hesitant to do that all the time. Wherever it makes sense, where I'm able to, I will do that. I don't consider myself an expert in Sanskrit, and I know most people watching this may or may not really care about it. They may not have any Sanskrit literacy, which is not required to read a scripture like this, because Yukteswar Giri himself has translated it into English. But still, some of these verses, I think it is nice to actually think about that split, and even whatever little we understand from the Sanskrit, it's sometimes helpful to meditate upon. So the very first verse, very first sutra of this chapter, Ato Mukti Jignasa, that is the Sanskrit verse, and this is the English translation. Hence, there is desire for emancipation. This is a very interesting verse. It's very simple, of course. What is he saying? Hence, there is desire for emancipation. You can say liberation, salvation. You can substitute with a lot of other words that mean the same thing. It's an interesting verse because it is a verse that's almost common to many, many great scriptures. Interestingly, a lot of Indian scriptures, I'm going to say multiple Indian scriptures, begin with this word thus or hence. A conclusion. The scripture begins with a conclusion, and it's ironical almost to think about it that way. And Yogananda, in his explanation of the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, he talks about it. And it is ironical because you're just starting a scripture, and yet you begin with the word thus. How does that make sense? It makes sense when we consider the fact that it is after a long journey of seeking that we have even arrived at this line, that we have picked up the scripture to study it. Thankfully, Yukteswar Giri does not use the word hence in the very first chapter, the first verse. He uses it in the second chapter because he has already explained why. So a scripture on Vedanta or a scripture on yoga often starts with the word thus or hence because Sankhya precedes it. A lot of the understanding of creation, the universe, man's relative position in this creation, all of that is fundamental before we can study the truth in its own essence. And that's why these all start with the word hence or thus. The Yoga Sutras start with the word Ataha Yoganushasanam, which means thus we come to the study or we come to the practice of the science of yoga. Now, what happened before that? There is a lot that happened before that. A lot of life experiences precede all of that. We have come to this realization that we need this study of yoga. In the same way, there is this great scripture, almost I might say the greatest scripture in Vedanta in the Indian system, that are called the Brahma Sutras. They were compiled by the great sage Vyasa, who wrote the Mahabharata, and they're so ancient that every great avatar, every great teacher that came translated and interpreted these sutras for their disciples for that particular time, whether it's Shankara, whether it's Ramanuja, whether it's Madhva, all the great teachers of Indian philosophy and the great avatars who incarnated on the Indian land, they always translated the Brahma Sutras. And these Brahma Sutras, it's a great scripture. It again begins with this one line, Atato Brahma Jignasa. And the translation of that line is, hence, there is the desire to know God or the desire to realize God. This is a great scripture that people want to study and they want to tune into, and it starts with this verse or the word hence. Thus, what precedes it? It clearly implies that you don't start here. This is the conclusion. This is the goal that you have attained. Where did you start? You look at the world around. You can just think of maybe even friends and family or even people that you know of. Just think about how sometimes people in this world can be blind to spiritual principles. People have to go through so many life experiences. I was watching a documentary about somebody who had done some crime, and there is this long story of what happened, and it was a documentary, but also there were pieces that were shot as a film with actors and such, but there were pictures of the original, I might say, criminals that they were showing at different parts, and you could just look into their eyes, I could look at their faces, and I could just see there was a significant amount of darkness. And when you see that, of course, I'm talking about an extreme example where somebody would murder or inflict harm on a lot of people. But if you think about it, that person actually thought, he believed that somehow killing somebody is going to make him happy. That actually taking somebody else's wealth, inflicting harm, just being sadistic, or inflicting great pain on other human beings is somehow going to fulfill him, is going to take him closer to his own goal. Whatever he's aspiring for is going to come by doing this particular action. Why else would he be doing that? Now, if you think about it, clearly, they are not reading the first verse of either the Brahma Sutras or the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali or Yukteswar's holy science, because they have not come to that point. They haven't learned through the anguishing monotony of many, many incarnations where we have tried to find this happiness in so many different ways and then come to this realization, it is not here. This truth that I'm seeking, this eternal verity, that's how the autobiography of a yogi even begins, this eternal verity that I'm looking for, my own potential that I want to live up to, I cannot find it in this world. I need to seek it within. I need to seek it from a different plane. I need to draw upon the divine grace. I cannot find it in anything that I can acquire in this world, whether it's from people, whether it's from wealth, whether it's from intoxicants, whether it's through sexuality, whatever it is. I cannot find that fulfillment here. Nothing here will be lasting. And of course, we still, all of us even listening to this, we may not have, at least we may not have attained that salvation yet. But in some part in ourselves, deep within ourselves, we have come to this understanding, or at least we have started grasping this realization that maybe it is not here. Maybe I'm looking for something. Maybe I need yoga. I need God realization. I need salvation. That's why we come to it. That's why we always begin with that sentence, hence, thus, therefore, we have come to the study of yoga. Therefore, we desire for God realization. And as Yukteswar states here, therefore, there is a desire for emancipation. I want to read the brief paragraph that he writes about this. When man understands the true nature of creation, the true relation existing between the creation and himself, and when he further understands that he is completely blinded by the influence of Maya, and it is the bondage of Maya which makes him forget his real self, he naturally wishes to be relieved from all these evils. The relief from evil or liberation from bondage of Maya becomes the prime object of life. When we truly understand that this is a show of light and darkness, that we are ignorant, we cannot perceive truth. That's what Yukteswar Giri has been explaining through all those verses of chapter 1, that we don't really perceive anything in this world, that our senses are incapable of grasping truth. And when we truly understand that we are in the bondage of this Maya, understand, I don't just mean theoretically study this book, but realize within our soul, realize on the deepest level through life experience, by lifting our own consciousness, by the grace of God and the grace of Guru, when we are able to realize that, then we naturally, I love that word, we naturally wish to be relieved from all these evils. I love that statement. We naturally want liberation. We naturally want salvation. If we are not naturally wanting it, if you meet somebody who's not naturally wanting liberation, which I'm sure there are a lot of people that we meet on a day-to-day basis, it is because they have not come to that point. This word hence or therefore does not apply for them. And then he goes on to say, almost as a comforting promise, then that liberation from bondage becomes the prime object of his life. That's what we want for all of us. This liberation is the prime object of life. Moving on to Sutra number 2. Muktihi Swarupe avasthanam. That's the Sanskrit verse, and the English translation is liberation is stabilization in its stabilization of the soul in its real self. Again, theoretically pretty self-evident what he's talking about. I'm going to read his explanation also. When man raises himself above the idea creation of this darkness and passes completely out of its influence, he becomes liberated from bondage and is placed in his real self, the eternal spirit. We also realize that what we are seeking is within ourselves. We are expressions of the divine. We are God moving through this world. In fact, it's not presumptuous or egotistical to say that God is acting through us. God is acting through us. It is only that it is that spirit, that divine consciousness flowing through us has been clouded by our egoic involvement, but by all the unlearned lessons, the bondage of Maya that we are bound by. And liberation itself is removing all that bondage and realizing that I'm one with all of creation. That's the beautiful poem Samadhi that our Guru Paramahansa Yogananda writes for us. When we realize that we are not this tiny bubble, but we are this entire ocean, and then we are stabilized, we are placed in our real self. We are established in that God consciousness. I'm not speaking from experience, but this thought itself is so wonderful to contemplate on. I'm going to move on because these are all very short and brief sutras. Sutra number 3, Tada sarva klesha nivrittihi paramartha siddhischa. And I'm going to read the English translation. Then there is cessation of all pain and the attainment of the ultimate aim. Tada sarva klesha nivrittihi. All pain is relieved. There is no pain of any sort. Paramartha siddhischa. We attain the ultimate goal of all goals, paramartha, the goal that we seek in this world. Artha simply means that which we seek, whatever we want to have and acquire. The highest thing that we can possibly acquire becomes ours. And I will read the paragraph of explanation that Yukteswar Giri writes. On attaining this liberation, man becomes saved from all his troubles and all the desires of his heart are fulfilled, so the ultimate aim of his life is accomplished. Again, I almost find these words and these verses comforting to read, because no matter where we think we are standing, no matter how unworthy we feel in our own hearts or how small we think we are, this is our future. This is written in our destiny. The moment we were manifested from pure spirit, from that vibration of Om, our resolution in that spirit was also written by the Creator. And when we attain that liberation, everything, all that pain and suffering is erased. Swami Kriyananda used to say this beautiful, he would offer this beautiful piece of idea to contemplate on. He would say, when he sees people suffer, when he sees people so shrouded in darkness, which we also do, sometimes our heart, yearns, it reaches out to people that suffer in that way. When we see such suffering in this world, he said he thinks about how much more sweeter and more beautiful it would be when that soul finally attains God realization, which is written in its destiny. That's really what Yukteswar is also saying here, because all pain and suffering, no matter how grave, how intense, how eternal it seems in the moment, will all be resolved when that goal is reached. Sutra number 4, I'm going to read the Sanskrit. Itaratra apurna kama janma janmantara vyapi dukkham. Otherwise, birth after birth, man experiences the misery of unfulfilled desires. He's stating just things very factually and simply. These are all, like I said, almost theoretical ideas for all of us, but we also know them to be true from our own deep soul intuition. So it is, as I keep saying again and again, really worth sitting with and meditating upon. So long, however, as man identifies himself with his material body and fails to find repose in his true self, he feels his wants according as his heart's desires remain unsatisfied. To satisfy them, he has to appear often in flesh and blood on the stage of life, subject to the influence of Maya, and has to suffer all the troubles of life and death, not only in the present, but in the future as well. Now, this verse is not as comforting, but it's again one of those ideas that helps us propel, that gives us the fuel to invest in our own spiritual journey, because as long as we even have one unfulfilled desire, it becomes the seed that needs to sprout, that needs to become a tree, that needs to bear more fruits. And we have to keep coming back again and again. Birth after birth, every unfulfilled desire is going to bring us back into this plane. It is going to bring us back into flesh and blood until we can liberate all of them. And it is almost impossible. This is how Yogananda ji always talked about it. It is impossible to fulfill every desire. When Yukteswar Giri says unfulfilled desires will bring you back onto this plane birth after birth, we cannot fulfill every desire, because every time you fulfill one desire, there's 10 more that spring up. There is this beautiful image in Indian mythology of this demon named Raktabija. And he is conquered, he's killed by Divine Mother in the form of Kali or Chandika. So the way the story is told is, this demon is so cruel and is so powerful. When you fight him on the battlefield, with every drop of his blood that falls on the battlefield, one more clone of him pops up. So he clones himself by every drop of blood. So whenever he is attacked, you're going to create so many copies of him. And what are we talking about? We are talking about the ideas of the mind. We are talking about desires. We are talking about thoughts. And when you try to fight with a thought in meditation, it leads to 10 other thoughts. When you try to pursue one desire passionately, it springs 10 other desires. It is that downward pulling energy in our own consciousness that has infinite capacity to lead us into the varied lanes and bylanes of Maya. There is no end to it. There is no end to how many times Raktabija can clone himself, because 10 drops of blood makes 10, but all 10 of them, if they all start dropping blood, it will lead to millions exponentially. From one drop, you can have 1,000,000 demons in no time. And how is he conquered? And in the story of Raktabija himself, Divine Mother incarnates as Kali, and she starts drinking this blood. Often Kali is depicted as such a gory image because she's drinking blood. She is absorbing that downward pulling tendencies of our consciousness. She's simply swallowing it. With every blood that follows, she doesn't let that blood touch the ground. She doesn't let that blood touch that field of consciousness, but rather she consumes it herself. Divine Mother absorbs it. And that way, when he's attacked in the battlefield, she is so thirsty for blood that every drop of blood is sucked into her mouth, and she digests it before it can sprout into another demon. Of course, a beautiful image and a prayer that we can all have when desires spring in our hearts. But in this particular example, it is important to remember that desires cannot just be satisfied, although when dissatisfied they lead to more births. They have to be transmuted. They have to be offered up. They have to be liberated in the fire of knowledge, in the fire of devotion, and they have to be burned up by offering at the spiritual eye. That is the practice of Kriya Yoga itself. That is the only way to liberate ourselves from the cycle of birth and rebirth and death. I don't mean just only Kriya Yoga. There may be many valid techniques and ways of doing that, but the only way is to offer those seeds of desires into that fire, that light of the spiritual eye, for them to be burned there. And when they're burned, there's nothing left to sprout. Then there is no unfulfilled desires that's going to cause you to incarnate. We cannot fulfill every desire. All of the desires ultimately have to simply transmuted. They will be transmuted as energy that can be absorbed through that spiritual consciousness. Moving on, Sutras 5 and 6. I'm going to first read Sutra number 5. Klesho Avidya Matrikaha. The translation of this verse is, troubles are born from ignorance. Klesho, trouble, avidya, ignorance or maya, matrikaha, mother. Maya is the mother of all troubles. What else can one say? I don't know if I need to explain that any further. Ignorance is the mother of all troubles. Bhava bhavo, abhave bhava, ityevam bodho avidya. It's a very interesting verse. Bhava abhavo, abhave bhava. And I will read the English translation. Ignorance is the perception of the non-existent and the non-perception of the existent. Bhava abhavo, perceiving the non-existent And then abhave bhava, not perceiving what actually exists. This is the nature of Maya or ignorance. What is he really talking about? Again, this is that shroud that descends on us. That is that force that is pulling away from God, the satanic pull of that downward pulling energy in our own spine. It creates this illusion. Maya is an illusion. It makes us perceive what is not there and not perceive what is there. In Shankaracharya Adi Shankara's commentary on the Brahma Sutras, again, all of this is the core of Vedanta philosophy, simply the truth as it's stated. And in his explanation of the Brahma Sutras and the way he explains this, he always gives the example of a rope, that you enter a dark room, you can barely see, and there is a rope, and you think there's a snake there. And you immediately act in fear. You jump up, and you're afraid that the snake might bite you. Now you're perceiving something that is not there. What are you perceiving? You're perceiving a snake, but there is no snake there. And you're not perceiving what is there. There is a rope, and you did not see that rope. You perceived something that was not there, and you did not perceive what was there. We have mistaken. We saw this world, we see this world and interact with it, and we misunderstand. We think somehow what the senses are revealing to us is real, and we forget that this is all simply the play of light and darkness. This is all God's consciousness creating a show in front of our eyes, that none of this is real. But Maya is such that we cannot perceive it. Even if we agree, even if we understand, even if we are told, we cannot live in that space all the time. When somebody says something harsh, we are immediately hurt. When somehow, we are attacked again, we know that we are not this body. Just, take a sharp object and take it near your eyes. You can tell yourself how many ever times you want, I'm not this body, I'm the pure soul. You will cringe, you will close your eyes. If you're not this body, what are you afraid of? What are you afraid of is being attacked. What can you lose? Because somebody can hurt your body, but nobody can hurt you. That's what Krishna says in the Bhagavad Gita. That's what all the liberated masters say. But if somebody tries to slap you, even before your mind kicks into action, you cringe back. You don't want to be touched that way. You don't want somebody to do that to you, because we want to protect our body. We are identified with that body because we are perceiving the non-existent. Our own identity with the body is not reality, and yet we are living with that deep, deep commitment to this ego and to this body. And we are, in fact, true souls. We are, in truth, souls that are completely timeless, birthless, deathless, but we cannot perceive that reality. We think that somehow I am 35 years old, I am this particular gender, I belong to this country, I like this, I don't like that. We constantly perceive and identify with the non-existent. When I say non-existent, these all do exist, but these are also figments of our own creation, because the only truth is we are the infinite soul, we are a manifestation of the divine, but somehow it is hard for us to perceive that and move with that understanding through this world, because again, we are shrouded with that Maya. So I think I'll stop there. We will look at sutras number 7 to 12 in the next episode of this series. I hope you found that inspiring and useful, and I'll see you all next week at the same time. Thank you all for sharing this with me. God bless you.